Well, good evening, everybody. I'm so happy that you guys were able to join us today. I think this is going to be a very special hour as we kind of get to discuss not just the documentary, but also to be able to share some of the knowledge that we have here tonight from either both professional and personal experiences in our relationship with grief. And so I like to start off by just introducing myself and then we can go around. My name is Anna Padron Sikora, and I am a licensed clinical social worker by training. And my day job is to be at Pillars Community Health. I am the Vice President of Community Engagement there, and been working with Michelle and Buddy's Place and Grief Services over the last few years. And so with that, maybe I can go right to Kristen if you want to introduce yourself.
Great, thank you. And thank you to Anna, Michelle, Carl, and Pillars for hosting us today. My name's Kristen James, and I have the honor of being the Executive Director of the Greater Illinois Pediatric Palliative Care Coalition. But more importantly, today really representing a new initiative in the Chicagoland, Missing Pieces, Sharing Support After Child Loss. And prior to my current role, I was the bereavement coordinator at Lurie Children's for about 20 years.
Thank you so much. Lauren?
Hi, everybody. I'm Lauren Wozniak. I am the program director at Willow House, which is a local grief organization within Illinois in the northern suburbs. I am a licensed clinical professional counselor and a registered art therapist. And I also have prior experience working in hospice as a children's grief coordinator, as well as an expressive therapist at Chicago Children's Center for Behavioral Health.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Amy?
Good evening. Sorry, I have a bit of a cold. My name is Amy McNicholas. I am a licensed clinical professional counselor. I work with Advocate Aurora Health Systems and also Catholic Charities Loss Program as a therapist, and the Loss Program services the loved ones of those who have died by suicide. But my proudest achievement is I am a mother of two boys. My oldest son, John, passed away of a brain tumor in 2011.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. And Carl?
Hi, everyone. My name is Carl Saffron. I'm an intern with Buddy's Place. And I'm sure Anna will say this, but if you have any questions you'd like the panelists to answer, feel free to put them in the Q&A and we can try to get those addressed, or either on the webinar or afterwards if we don't have time. So please use the Q&A function if you have any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carl. And Michelle?
Hi, I'm Michelle Holm. I'm the director of Buddy's Place, which is Pillars Community Health Bereavement Support Program for children, teens, and their families. Prior to becoming the director of Buddy's Place, I was a volunteer for the program and had that experience. Prior to that, I was a high school teacher, and so I hold my professional educator's license both in secondary education and in school counseling. So I'm grateful to be here today and have a very well-rounded and knowledgeable panel, both in professional experience and personal experience as well. I also am a bereaved sibling, and so might be able to bring some of that, my experiences, to today's conversation as well. But before we jump into some of the questions and discussion, I want to thank the New York Life Foundation and WPSU for putting together this documentary. I think it is so important that we're able to speak about grief. So speaking grief is a language that hopefully we all learn and can have conversations with compassion, intention, and support those that have experienced a loss due to death or other losses as well. November is Children's Grief Awareness Month, and so throughout this month, many organizations, both locally and across the country, are holding events. The National Alliance for Grieving Children has a list on their website of grief support programs across the country. And Lauren, as she had said, she's with Willow House up in the north suburbs of Chicago. And then Missing Pieces is a phenomenal resource that has a comprehensive list of bereavement and grief support programs throughout the Chicagoland area. So we are happy to be part of that project and can't wait to see all the positive support and movement forward we make there. New York Life Foundation is instrumental in helping bring grief to the forefront. And so we are grateful for the grants and the education and the opportunities they bring. And so tonight we're going to be sharing some resources. Some that you might hear will include the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, or the Childhood Bereavement Estimation Model that Judy's House JAG Institute has put together and the research they've done. But I'm sure there'll be others as well. We'll try to keep a running list of resources, and we will send that out after this webinar as well. So those are kind of some of the front-ended announcements. And so if you have any questions, like Carl said, please use the Q&A or the chat feature, and we will do our best to answer those as we can.
Thank you, Michelle. And, you know, I think that the way we wanted to organize our time together really is in a informative yet somewhat informal way. So I will ask a couple of questions. Some of them will be directed at one of our panelists. But again, this is meant to be that if you have something to add, or if you want to like validate a point or support a point, please, it's meant to be informal in that way. And in the same with the questions, I think if, as we start talking, if there's a specific question to a specific panelist, or if there's a general question, we will field those as well. So, so with that, you know, wanting to get into a discussion about the documentary that, you know, we just saw or that we've seen recently, and there's many points throughout the documentary that really kind of spoke to me, and I'm guessing that that's a common experience. And so I know that when we were preparing for this discussion, just the fact where everybody was wearing their t-shirts and that it said the name, not the name, but the relationship of the person that they lost was so kind of powerful. And the conversation about what if we weren't so uncomfortable with grief, right? What if we could really do a better job with grief? And so throughout our discussion today, wanting us to think about, like, what would that look like, right? If we could do something different, as the narrator spoke. We on some level know that we're all grievers, and we've any person we encounter has experienced some type of grief, and yet as again mentioned in the film, it's so taboo to talk about. And so the visual image of the t-shirts with the relationship, it's again very powerful, because it would open a discussion that we don't open right now, right? That we don't give ourselves permission, or we're not comfortable having that discussion. So as I think about other questions, I'll pose them as we go on. But thinking about the kind of the different narratives through the story and their grief journey, one of the things that came up was about how do you introduce the loss? Like, how do you talk about the person, or how do you inform somebody that this person, or that you have experienced something, if they're not aware? And so I don't know if I want to pose that out there to see either professionally or personally, how have you dealt with that? So anybody can go, or we could, if
Oh, Kristen, you're on mute.
You know, and I'm glad you brought up the imagery of the t-shirts. That I think that's a really powerful beginning and ending to the documentary. And I often wish that we had some visual representation that people knew we were grieving. I'm a little envious in some cultures where you do wear black for a year, or you wear a band, or in the Jewish community where you put a torn piece of fabric. Just letting people know that something is different for you, letting people know that you've had a loss, and to ask. But I think also what really stands with me is how powerful the image was at the beginning when she started to show her loss, her grief, and closed back up. That so often we as grievers bear the burden of who can tolerate our pain, right? That often somebody will ask, oh, how are you today? And the response might be, I'm okay. But really the griever, I'm okay is, are you willing to ask me the next question? As a support group, or a supporter, are we willing to lean in and ask one more question? Because okay doesn't describe anything. It's really actually an invitation of, can you ask me more? We used to laugh in group, and adults would share with me all the cliches that would come out of that though too, right? Like, at least they're in a better place. At least you can have more children. At least. Well, anytime you start a conversation with at least, it's probably not a helpful conversation. But I think we often feel the need to put a Band-Aid and make it better. But there really is no way to make it better, but there sure is a way of being together. So I guess that would be mine, is sort of, can we lean in? Can we be brave enough to ask the next question? Can we be brave enough to still bear witness to the pain? But in bearing witness to the pain, you also get to hear amazing stories and be a part of that person's history and that relationship. And that's really the invitation that I hope more will seek.
What about the idea that if we bring up the loved one, that we'll make them sad? That somehow talking about them will remind them about the loss?
Yeah, I can take that one. With that, I think grievers are always going to be thinking about their loved one and thinking about their person. And so whether the outside party has brought it up or not, we're still thinking about them. And so it's actually more so that the griever wants wants to share, wants to talk about it. And I think about, in my own personal experience, I lost my mom to suicide after her battle with bipolar disorder. And I love talking about my mom. It's the happiest part for me to discuss her. And so I want people to ask. I want that leaning in, as Kristen said. I want that follow-up question. I crave to share more stories about her.
Yeah, I was going to say that it's so important. And it's so important for the griever to be able to, and especially coming from an experience of losing a child, to be able to say my child's name, to be able to share their story. And many times though, it's, again, I love that they said, one of the goals is to make space for grief, because it is uncomfortable, and it's uncomfortable for the person, that is experiencing it, but also the people around them, the people that love them. So it's about their lived experience too. So to be able to really create the space and understand that it's so important to talk about that loved one, share memories, I think that's one of the greatest gifts. And again, Kristen also talks about the idea of, real empathy. We talk about empathy, but being able to sit with, listen when people are really raw is just a beautiful gift, because you can't fix it.
Yeah, and that sometimes we find ourselves taking out, like Kristen's saying kind of cliches, because we don't know what to say, instead of just sitting and listening to what the griever wants to really share. Mm-hmm. Michelle?
We have a question. Someone says, what are some good follow-up questions to how are you? I'm not sure what invitation I'd like to receive or extend to the other person, but where do people go when If they know that you're grieving and they ask how you are, and you give them, one of our common non-deep responses.
Mhm.
I'm smiling because I'm smiling because early in my journey, I think of the movie, You Can't Handle the Truth. Like even that question of how are you? You don't want to know. I don't know. I can't tell you. So, I mean, again, to Kristen's point, the idea of kind of leaning into that and really listening to their answers and their responses and what they're communicating, even kind of their body language, is, I think, just so important, because again, I think we come in with kind of asking these questions, but then the next question we want to ask, or the next thing we want to say to make them feel better, and really to that active kind of listening is so important.
And I was just going to kind of add to that too, that sometimes it's just an open-ended question as far as, what's a good day look like? Tell me about a bad day. I know Saturday was a day you used to walk with your dad. What do you do on Saturdays? It may even bringing in a detail about that person or relationship. But I think the other part of that question that I'm hearing too is rehearsing our answers. I think often when we've had a loss, it's also having to practice a little how we're going to respond to those questions. Who are we going to trust with our real answer? But even the simple questions like, how many children do you have? And how many different ways do we want to answer that based on how we're feeling that day? Or who's asking it? Is it in the grocery store? But I also think of kids on the first day of school. What does almost every kid ask the first day of school? Draw me a picture of your family. Who's in your family? Well, kids have to negotiate how to answer that too. So I often, encourage families, both individually but collectively, to talk through those answers and kind of almost rehearse them, because sometimes otherwise the emotion can get stronger than being able to kind of facilitate what that answer wants to be. But recognizing that answer changes situation to situation too.
Well, and I think asking the question, Kristen, you said it earlier, how are you today? Being a little bit more specific, or even if it's somebody that you're working with or you're close to, how are you this morning? Because we can change how we're doing, very often throughout the day or week. And so having a little bit more specificity with that question can be helpful. And then in terms of wanting the follow-up questions, depending on the relationship, and like you said, where you are, who it is, I think sometimes we can lean in as the person answering that question and help them understand where we're at, so that if it's a person that can provide support, so that they know that we're open to that at that time.
What about the concept about, it came up a couple of times in the movie about the timeline, like how long people should grieve, or that there was a statement that that even the griever was surprised that after 6 months, after a year, that it was there was good days and bad days. What are your thoughts around that, and how kind of like the expectations that we put on grief and time? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I'll step in that. I think even Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who many of you may recognize, is sort of one of the first professionals to put labels to grief. Unfortunately, she also put timelines. But even in her own growth and understanding grief, she says that was one of her biggest regrets. But I think what it does do is it can describe grief, right? When we kind of look at phases and stages, it can describe what we feel, but there is no timeline. There's no end to your grief. There's, and in fact, I liked in the movie that one of the individuals even talked about the second year, and how surprised the second year was even harder. That I think we often put unrealistic expectations on ourselves about where we should be in our grief. And anytime you use a should, that again is probably a red flag that it's not a helpful situation.
We use the phrase a lot, don't let people should on you. And so, yeah, to go to your point, should's not always the best term.
What about the hidden anger? Oh, sorry. I wanted to say, what about the hidden, the underlying anger, like those hidden emotions? But please, like Lauren, say if you have something to say about the timeline, that's so important.
No, I was just going to say too, often we have families reaching out to Willow House just to simply ask that type of question, to say like, I know I should be feeling better at this point, again, going with those shoulds, or, you know, maybe they might label themselves as, maybe I'm feeling crazy that, you know, it's been 6 months and, you know, where am I at right now? And I think that just comes back to that education of grief to the community and our society. Because of the structure that we have built around the ideas of grief, it's really important to get that educational piece out there that, right, just as we said, grief does not have a timeline. It does not have a should. And then, Anne, I started to hear you talking about anger and kind of these underlying emotions that can be hidden. I like to think about grief as being seen and unseen, thinking about the way we internalize it and the way we externalize it. And I know, like, with a lot of kiddos, they might thinking about like the physical reactions in the body, so stomach aches, headaches, the way that grief can come out, and they might even be experiencing, and adults too, this anger and like these emotions inside, but not really knowing what to do with it, where to put it, how to expel it out of the body. And so that there can be these feelings of grief that we don't really understand where it's coming from. And so it's the next part of that is like finding what is the next step, what is our coping skill to deal with this anger. And so just touching on for kids, it's going to be a lot in that play, in creative expression, in exercising and outdoor activity, or, you know, physical activities, doesn't have to be outdoors. And so it's helping the younger kids find ways of processing, but even for adults too, it can be difficult to find how we want to expel these, you know, inside emotions.
Yeah, I loved how they talked about the children's grief, and that it's not it's not miniature adult grief, that it's going to look different, and that at different stages of their lives that they're going to grieve again, right? And like at that in different milestones at different developmental stages. And so I think that again in families where the grief is so present, that I feel like those details about children's grief is so important to educate. So, anything to add on that, Kristen or Amy or Michelle, about children's grief or what it looks like?
I think the one thing to acknowledge is kids kind of have built-in like pressure valves, if you will. So they know kind of how much they can hold at a certain time. Not always, but a lot of the times. And so we'll see kids grieving kind of go in and out of that. And so sometimes their emotions are really big, and then they can flip and they're like, oh, I want a snack. And we're bewildered by like, what just happened? And oftentimes we're kind of left holding those emotions, and you know, they're off running down the playground and we're not sure what has happened. I think as we get older, I mean, for good or bad, sometimes we suppress our natural, when we could stop going down a path, sometimes we suppress that and we continue down that, where they will go in and out of that a little bit. And I'm sure all of you, you know, the other panelists have seen that in both personal and or professional situations as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, a lot of times with some of our kids that we see, either we don't see them, you know, until there's kind of another problem that manifests itself kind of down the road, or we see them very early on, but then we see them again. And many times, you know, the young adults will come after a loss from quite a while before, and it'll kind of manifest itself in kind of interpersonal relationship issues. So that's sometimes when we really kind of see it. But yeah, there's not that kind of connection, and they're a lot more kind of concrete. And as the movie also said, it can really be kind of manifested in kind of physical expressions and behavioral expressions.
I was just going to kind of add to that. I think of grief, it's physical, it's in our behavior, it's emotional, it's spiritual, it's social, it's financial, it's cognitive. Like there is, it impacts all part of who we are. And often, but we all have different tendencies. If you were a physical person before, that's probably how you're both going to feel it and need to express it, or emotional. And I know we were talking earlier even about gender stereotypes. And I believe even early in the movie, one of the dads kind of talked about he needed to fix things, and they had him in the garage, and that was his way of coping, is sort of being the fixer. And one, I do want to do a shout out to our men, that I think often our men don't get the same level of support as our women, that we have a tendency to talk in a more feminine voice and approach the women. We ask how our wives are, we ask how our mothers are. But I also want to challenge us to think of it not in gender stereotypes, because we all express ourselves differently. That I've really liked sort of the new definitions, a more instrumental griever and an intuitive griever. Instrumental, you're a doer, you're a thinker. That's how you're going to cope with your grief. You're going to play basketball, you're going to read a book, you're going to research the disease, you're going to do. And that's also how you want to be supported, and sort of, it's also often very independent. And then you have your intuitive griever, who probably is much more comfortable with emotions and wants to be around people and wants to have that social support. So often I really challenge families to kind of be able to articulate where they're more comfortable. I think we all land on a spectrum, but be able to kind of articulate what your grief looks like and how you want to be supported. One of the biggest messages in the documentary that I feel we need to talk more about is intent and interpretation. Our intent to support each other is also good, often in good intents, but it doesn't always feel good. And so being able to kind of be able to describe and clarify that of what feels good for you. Otherwise, you're going to set other people up. You're going to be resentful. But if they don't know how to support you, then you're probably not going to get what you need.
I loved that part of the video that said, what if our actions matched our intents? Right? And then they showed that list of all the concrete things that could make everyday life a little bit better, and so sometimes, again, going back to the doers, right? That we need to do something to help. And it may be that it's mowing the lawn, doing the laundry, cooking making dinner. And so I think I love that idea when they said, well, here's a list, you let me know, because again, it's about choice, but that the griever doesn't have to come up, doesn't have to problem solve what the solution is. It's more, it's a very concrete, supportive way that then again matches the intent. So.
Yeah, Anna, I was going to say that concrete is so important, especially early on with kind of acute grief support.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just going to reflect too, when my mom died, I was in college. And so for me, I had floods of Facebook messages from people I hadn't seen in years, from, people from high school. It's just like, let me know how I can support you. I'm here if you want to talk. And I know I hear this too from families that attend Willow House. I'm sure all of you guys as well have heard this. It's just like that general statement of, I'm here for you. Okay, what are we going to do with that? So I wish I had known back then to say, this is what I need from you. Here are some examples, but I didn't have that knowledge yet, or that, knowing that it's okay to ask for what I needed.
Well, I think it goes to Kristen's point earlier. Like, do you really want to know? Do you really want to help? And so I think sometimes, at least in some situations I've been in, I don't want to give you an idea or a way that you can do that and have that be rejected as well. Because I don't have the bandwidth for that, like I can't sustain that. So it's easier just to be like, I'm good. And so I think when we're supporting grievers, when you ask those questions, they said, and Anna had mentioned, make sure your actions match your intent. Don't make hollow offers like, can I pick up the kids from school, or can I make you dinner, or can I do your laundry? If you say those things and you're willing to be helpful, please, by all means, follow through, because that's the last thing anyone needs, is one more thing to not have gone their way.
Yeah, and that consistent kind of presence, I think one of the people in the movie kind of spoke about the idea that at the beginning everybody was bringing them things, but she would really have appreciated it a little bit further down the road and could have really used it. So again, that idea where everybody's kind of there, but you're still kind of in that shock time. And so to that consistent presence, I think is really important and can be really helpful. I know I had a friend and when I was early grieving, that she would bring me tea, and then sometimes I wouldn't even answer the door, but she would leave tea right outside my door every morning for months after my son died. And it's something 10 years into this, I still remember, and I'm so grateful.
Anna, we have a question. It says, how do you help a child cope with grief? How can you best support students who have lost parents or siblings? So 2 questions. How do you help a child cope with grief? I will start. Children are often forgotten grievers and overlooked. And so I think it's important that we recognize that their grief exists and it's valid and it needs to be supported just like adults. Oftentimes people think young children are too young to grieve, but if they're old enough to love somebody, they're old enough to grieve and to miss that bond, that connection. So I think it's important to recognize the children's grief as well.
Yeah, and to add on to that with, as an art therapist, I'm biased toward the creative outlet, but it has been proven as well that creativity in any form, so it doesn't have to be that 2-dimensional drawing and painting, it can be sculpting, writing, puppet play, drama therapy, all these different creative outlets are really a key tool for the way that children can express themselves. They may not have that label or that grasp on what it is that they're feeling or what it is that they're experiencing. They may know that what's happening is very profound around them, but again, not knowing what to do with that emotion or feeling. So through the play, it allows for a sense of communication without having to be verbal and without having to put a label on it. So asking a child to draw their feeling, just say, what does your anger look like? Putting it onto paper, they might use blue, where a lot of people might think blue is calm, but we want to ask the child, what does that color represent for you? To kind of gain their insight. It's a new way of processing. It gives you different perspectives, thinking about a little bit older up into the age group. I do a lot of writing with teenagers or preteens, and this writing allows for a new perspective, a new way to see their emotions because it's down on something tangible. It's like expelling it. All I can do with my hands is just like expelling it, getting out of the body, putting it into something that they can hold, so that they can grasp it and kind of internalize it a little differently.
I know. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I kind of think I often kind of put it in three buckets a little. First, kids need honesty, right? They need information. They need words. They need death and dying. Because the implications of loss of my mom's loss, aren't we going to go find her, right? Up in heaven. Well, how do I get there? So they need honesty, they need information. Of course, that's developmentally. So what you're going to talk with a 2-year-old, 10-year-old, or 15-year-old may be a little different. But they need to have honest information so that things can be predictable as well. but to their children and children first. So as Lauren said, they're going to ask you, I always say it's always on the car ride to the grocery store. They're going to dump a big question on you, but they want it in bite sizes. And then they're going to go back, they're going to process it, and they're going to come back again and process and back. So often repetition, they just need to hear it again and again. Partly because they want to make sure your answers don't change. They don't really trust you always. So they want to make sure your answers stay the same.
Mhm.
And those questions will change over time as developmentally they understand it a little different as well. But then three, they really do need routine. Kids feel much safer in a routine. So sometimes it's a conversation about what's going to stay the same and what's going to be different. You know, if your dad died and your dad took you to school every day, well, who's going to take you to school today? As concrete as those things, who's going to tuck me in bed at night? Or if my sister used to walk the dog and my sister died, who's going to walk the dog? So some really just basic ideas and conversations about routine. And helping that child then just feel safer. We often talk about kids don't want rules. Well, actually rules do feel safer. And when somebody dies, the world is spinning. And so sometimes they need us to help them be able to control what they can and understand what is different and what's going to be the same.
And oftentimes they're also wondering big questions that we don't always want to answer. If it has been a death of somebody close to them, they're, especially if it's a caregiver, you know, in a parental role or something, they're worried that the other caregiver might die as well. So having conversations with the kids about, you know, we don't anticipate anything happening right now, but you don't make promises either. Oftentimes we want to say like, well, that's not going to happen to me, or I'm going to be here for a really, really long time. And so we need to have those conversations openly and honestly with them. And they're wondering and they're worried about who's going to take care of me if something happens. And that's a hard conversation to have. But time and time again, we've seen at Buddy's Place, when parents, you know, we encourage the adults to have those conversations, and they kind of walk out being like, yeah, I don't know if that's ever crossed, you know, the child's mind. And then they're like, oh my goodness, they were so worried about this. And so, you know, having that conversation is important as well, and not making promises.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to something from the movie and that you all touched on about secondary losses. You know, and I know that for like, you know, you all mentioned like those things, those routines, and the loss of those routines are definitely what kiddos are worried about, especially initially, right? And so I think that, and then as we heard in the movie, that the secondary losses is it's kind of what impacts our functioning, right? And so that, like, if we have to move or we have to kind of change, you know, what we were used to doing, and so how that plays out in families. And so I don't know if you want to add anything about secondary losses.
They change over time. You know, and I think the place that I kind of feel like secondary losses sometimes go unnoticed is the school community. Sometimes families need to move because they need to be closer to supports, or income causes a family to have to relocate. And oftentimes we don't always have those conversations with the new students, and so we don't understand what the secondary losses might be. And they change over time. And so, like Kristen said, like a 5-year-old versus a 7-year-old versus a 15 versus a 25-year-old, their secondary loss is going to be different at different points in their life. And so grief doesn't end, it's not time limited. And so we need to consider those things and keep those things in mind. And a secondary loss that's also, I think, often unrecognized is the change in the role. And so that could be with peers, it could be in the workplace, it could be the way the family sees you. And so relationships and the change in role are definitely secondary losses, I feel like, that are sometimes overlooked as well.
Well, and we have about 15 minutes left. And so I'm curious about, and again, we talked a little bit about statements like um, never, like, we're never going to go back to who we used to be, right? Like, we can only be who we are now. Or another statement in the movie about that grief is a sense of brokenness, and that and so when you hear these words, and when we think about the different grievers in our lives or ourselves as grievers, what are your thoughts about that, or how do we think about those narratives? So,
Well, I think most people will say they mark time no longer by the calendar, but before the death and after the death. And everything becomes compared to that date, the before and the after. Um, and I'm glad that we're sort of understanding more the need to hold on while moving forward. I think an old kind of theories and old culture was letting go, right? Forget. And in fact, many, there will still be that messaging, just move on, forget the person. But I think we're realizing that part of our strength and part of our healing is actually holding on while moving forward. And I think grief is work, but one important part of that work is, where do you find meaning? Then that's sort of been a key point of how I've been able to witness amazing healing. And just what is that meaning of that death, that person? It can be very personal, very private, and it can be something big in public and in your community. But helping that individual identify for themselves, it's not something we can do for a person, but that work put in to find meaning in the life and the death of that loved one. And where do they find meaning?
yeah, I love that.
Yeah, and that really looks different for every person, how we kind of integrate the loss. Speaking from a point of a bereaved mother, how do we integrate that loved one into our life in a way that makes sense and is meaningful? And it can look very different. And to go back to that question, just to add on that first question that we talked about, in terms of like when someone asked that question of how are you doing, the other piece about that I like to say to grievers is that idea that that's your answer, it's your story. So, because sometimes it's like, I don't know if I should say that, my husband died, or that I even have a child, like how many children do I have, things like that. And there's no right or wrong answer to that. And I think that that's just really important to kind of empower people to understand that, within their journey. But back to the question, sorry, that was a bit of an aside, but back to that question of the kind of integration and making meaning. I think that's so important. And I also think that when we're talking about no time limit, that it's so important to understand that it isn't a process, and it's this journey. And it doesn't happen, you don't wake up and you're okay the next morning, but it does soften, and as we go through it, and things do change, and there's meaning, and there's opportunity in the suffering to really inform your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what I'm hearing from both you, Kristen and Amy, is that idea of continuing bonds and keeping that relationship with the person even after they're gone. Because now we know that, as Kristen said, we're not here to forget that person. We're here to continue our relationship. Even though their physical presence is no longer with us, we can still be with them in whatever way it feels right to you, in spirit, in soul, in memory. We can continue the relationship, but it's going to ebb and flow too. As from my own experience, as I've gotten older, hit different milestones in my life, and same as, if a child loses somebody at a really young age, throughout their entire life, their relationship will also continue to change with the deceased. I will be getting married in 6 months. And so I'm trying to find out ways for myself to connect with my mom through this wedding process, even though she is not physically present. with young children. I mean, any of these milestones, graduation, birthdays, small things like getting an A on your test, and whatever it is for that person that they want to celebrate, it's finding a way to keep connected to their person.
And I think that this year in particular, that so many things are kind of different and changing with the pandemic, that I feel like a lot of the conversations has been about creating new traditions or kind of changing to really kind of what feeds your soul or your family in general. But I think that it's a good time to also give yourself permission on that. What's important to you, right? Like what do you want the holidays to look like? What do you want to set up for future family gatherings, and so thinking that because this is a good year to make any of those adjustments that kind of really maybe you've been wanting to make and haven't kind of had the right opportunity to, and that how do we give each other permission in a different way as grievers in this particular year. So I don't know if I see you nodding, if you have any kind of additional thoughts about that as we continue through the pandemic.
I just want to thank you, Anna, because that was kind of been wearing on me that I don't think we can be talking today without talking about COVID and how it's impacting all of us, directly, indirectly, every day, every moment, right? And both, how's that impacting us as grievers? The ways that we used to cope. I mean, if you, it may be forcing us to cope differently, even in how we grieve and connect to others. And I'm mindful of all those who've had losses this year who may not have been able to gather together and memorialize in the way that we typically would offer to do. Or our children who are in school who normally that's their special person. If a parent has died, there's a teacher who still checks in with them on a regular basis. So I'm very mindful of how COVID has really impacted our ability to support each other, our ability to grieve, our ability to memorialize. And as you said, there is that way, is that as we think of the holidays this year, how are we shifting? And how are we shifting from what used to be and what was traditional versus allowing those choices this year? Limited, unfortunately. But what choices do we have? And what choices do we have to still bring in ritual? What ways can we still remember that person? What ways can that person's presence still be with us at each and every holiday? And so, but I'm mindful that I think Amy had said too, it's individual and it's collective. That I think individually we each need to ask ourselves those questions and ponder a little. But there's also family decisions around that too. And how can we invite our children in to that conversation about how do they want to remember grandma this year? How do they want to remember their brother this year? And making sure that they have voice in some of those decisions as well. But knowing, I want to be very mindful that this year in particular is different for all of us.
The phrase I keep finding myself saying in emails and conversations is just give yourself grace, finding that time just to say, okay, take a deep breath, whatever it is that you need, but just giving yourself the opportunity to allow things to be different. And I know that is much easier said than done. Just giving grace for a moment, for a full ritual, whatever is needed.
Well, and I think, the pandemic speaks to the different types of grief. Right now we're grieving collectively. Schools, the loss of traditional school settings, the loss of being able to gather with friends in ways we might have been able to. Cumulatively, the pandemic, our relationships are, all of those things are kind of building on each other and they're accumulating. And then there's ambiguous loss and ambiguous grief as well. Sometimes we're not sure what we're grieving that day. And I feel like that is kind of a narrative I keep hearing across the board, and I think that's only going to amplify as we move into the holiday season. And so making sure that we're aware of all those things. And then those that are disenfranchised as well, due to the relationship that they might have had with the person who died, or sometimes there's stigma around the way a person dies. And so all of that disenfranchisement also can amplify during the holiday season. So I think it's important to acknowledge that as well.
Yeah, I think connection, I mean, the movie talked about, presence, right? So we want to, and now more than ever, we want to connect with people, be present, really listen to people and understand how important that is. And that, this isolation, when we think about isolation, and when you lose someone, you can feel very kind of alienated and isolated. So that presence and connection with people, especially right now, I think is so important.
Yeah. And in the movie, it talked about how finding the supports that kind of match your grief, and so with the young lady with her brother, that she had tried a couple of different support groups and they weren't the right one until she found the military support that really was the one that connected with her. But I think about in the movie how it also talks about being able to have that if we can be kind of ambassadors to these conversations and that they're going to be uncomfortable and awkward, and that, we're going to make mistakes, and that it's, and I love when she's like, I probably made a mistake in this video, and so I think that's us also being very human, right, in this process, and that we don't, if we misspeak or we say something, that we can kind of check ourselves and say, what would be helpful, what would be helpful, or how can I say this differently, or how do we kind of engage in this process, instead of like, which came up several times in the movie about that saying nothing is the worst, right? Like and like even in the beginning where the guy's at the grocery store and then the woman looks at him and then kind of keeps walking, and that it's like, oh, and then at the end when she like, it's such a simple gesture, but that it changed everything for that person,
Yeah,
and so
powerful. That was so powerful at the end. Yeah.
Yep, no words, right? No words were needed. Yeah. And I think that it's true, is that as we're kind of in this kind of semi-shelter at home, how do we continue to support each other so that folks don't feel like they are alone, and that and so that we have to be even more intentional of our conversations, because we're not maybe running into each other at work or at school, right? And so that we have we have to kind of intentionally reach out in a different way. So, so we have just about a minute or so left. Any final thoughts? I know we're going to share resources after this. Anything you want to make sure we close out with?
I know there was a question earlier a little bit about supporting students in schools who've been impacted by the death of a parent or sibling. Does anyone want to address that before we wrap up?
I apologize, Michelle. I was just looking at the chat that came in.
School supporting children in schools with sibling or parental loss.
I think with schools, it's really important to identify, so I'm thinking, of course, my brain automatically goes to in person. So my brain is like, okay, let's identify someone who is in the school building, who the child can go and talk with. But I think that can definitely be true too in this digital setting. I've met with a lot of school counselors and psychologists who have office hours on Zoom. They kind of leave their digital doors open for students to connect with. But I think having a plan in place can be beneficial, whether it is somebody to talk to, what are those coping skills to be reacting with. And I apologize, this is like a very brief general statement with just a little bit of time left. But
I
those would be
think,
my two suggestions first. So
we could also share some of the resources we have for like the National School Crisis, right, and the bereavement programs and things like that, because there's amazing tools from that really a lot of people have done a lot of good work around. So I think to do this question more justice, right, I think we could share some of those websites and some of those resources that you know, and then we could always have more follow-up conversation.
Right.
Yeah,
And I
no.
also want to mention the New York Life Foundation has the Grief Sensitive School Initiative. So they have ambassadors for that program that come out to your school now via Zoom and do a brief presentation, and they often pair with local bereavement support programs. And then the school is eligible for a $500 grant. And the presentations usually, you know, do not exceed 30 minutes. And so that's a way for the staff to become grief informed and also use that grant to help bring in supplies or speakers or other things like that. So I will include that information in as well. In terms of support groups for specific types of losses, yes, there are lots of different support groups. Missing Pieces has some of those listed on theirs. In our chat, there's a couple more specific ones, so we will try to answer that. And I will also send out a list of other websites, and so that hopefully will be helpful as well.
And I just want to say thank you for this kind of offering this, because I mean, this creating this space for conversation about grief is just so important, because we have to start having these conversations even if they're uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
I was just going to add to that, Amy, that this is, you know, really an opportunity for us to lean in and being courageous and vulnerable, both as grievers and as supporters, to be able to be brave enough to ask another question or be brave enough to tell our story, but also to be vulnerable enough for whatever emotions it does bring up too, and be able to be present with that. So I'm just, you know, that would be sort of what I sit with, is that willingness to lean in, be courageous and vulnerable. Joe.
No. And so with that, I thank you all for such wonderful conversation, and you know, really the grief work is to provide the space and to listen. And so I'm grateful that we can have more of these kind of conversations and continue to not just educate but support each other. So.
Next Thursday's Children's Grief Awareness Day. Blue is the color that is often, or that is associated with Children's Grief Awareness. And so we hope that you'll wear something blue, and also do maybe a little bit of research into other ways that you can help support and have the conversation around grief. It would be great if we all learned to speak grief.
Thank you.
thank you.